Hal Stewart from Megamind is one of the more interesting villains to come out of DreamWorks Animation, both for how vague many aspects of his character really are, as well as for the changing attitude regarding how audiences viewed him. Because when Megamind was first released, many felt sorry for Hal and felt that it was Roxanne's rejection of him that drove him to become a villain, which, while still most definitely taking it the wrong way and being responsible for his own actions, as I detailed in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, is something many can still relate to and thus sympathize with him on some level. But as the years have gone on, however, many have started viewing him in a much more negative light, arguing that his early characterization reveals that he was never a good person at all, and Megamind simply unleashed the monster that was already inside him by giving him Metro Man's powers. It's even gotten to the point that he's been hailed as extremely ahead of his time in regards to his entitlement issues being put in a very bad light. And today, I'd like to take a look at which perception of him is the more accurate one based off his actions throughout the movie, to the best of my ability. And as you all probably already know, there will be even more spoilers for Megamind ahead. So in case you don't want the entire movie ruined, do yourself a favor and turn off the video. Okay, so when all is said and done, the question here basically boils down to if Hal Stewart is meant to be a sympathetic or tragic villain, and if his fall from grace was more the result of circumstance or an accident just waiting to happen. And honestly, I would say the answer to that is a pretty complicated one, because simply put, Hal is definitely not the best person even before he got superpowers. He believes virtues are a sham, makes no effort to actually get to know the person he's attracted to, and acts like a total creep around her, and only tries to act better in her presence in order to impress her. But the thing is, none of that automatically makes him a bad person. It can make him unpleasant, sure, and a bit of a jerk most wouldn't want to hang around with, but in the end, he's basically just your average member of society. Even at his worst, he doesn't appear to mean anyone harm, and while he doesn't take Roxanne's repeated rejections well, it's not like he poses a real danger to her or anybody else. In other words, it's unfortunate that Roxanne has to deal with somebody like Hal at all, but she also could have done a lot worse. I mean, as I said in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too, it's debatable if she even viewed him as a friend, but she doesn't have a problem talking with him and even tells him at one point that he's a good person. So whatever his reason may have been, he clearly had lines he wouldn't cross. But as for why he wouldn't cross them, that's another story. Maybe he did have some kind of moral compass that got thrown out later on, or maybe it had just never occurred to him that he could cross those lines to begin with. Now that being said, there are those who have argued that his nicer side is all an act and that he was nothing but a selfish, entitled sociopath that was simply trying to be as appealing as possible so Roxanne would be receptive to his advances. However, I don't think that's the case for two reasons. Firstly, Hal isn't that smart. Sure, he clearly knows he can attract more flies with honey than with vinegar, but he's way too stupid to be openly manipulating both Roxanne and the audience for half the runtime. And the second reason is that he just doesn't show signs of being a sociopath until he gets his powers. Now, I already dedicated a whole separate video to arguing that he wasn't initially a sociopath, which you can also find a link in the description too, but just to go over it quickly again, he seems to feel just a little too much empathy and human emotion at certain points to be considered a sociopath. Like when Roxanne declines to go to his party, he seems upset by her rejection but blames himself for it, not her, which does indicate he knows that he's the problem. Sure, he's on the wrong track as to why, but at least he's willing to admit that her rejection is on him. Or even later on, after Roxanne rejects him for good, when he's watching her and Bernard through the window at the restaurant, he's not angry. He looks totally heartbroken. And that's just not a look a sociopath would ever have. Now once again, obviously he goes about handling her rejection all wrong, but there is evidence that he did at least have some good in him before going off the deep end. But before I go any further, let me just note that I am not trying to argue that Hal was actually some kind of saint before he got his powers or anything like that. Not at all. Hal clearly had a lot of issues to work out and definitely suffered from both an entitlement and rejection problem. I mean, when a girl makes it as obvious as Roxanne does that she's not interested in being anything more than acquaintances, a guy should get the hint and leave her alone. And that's not even getting into how dismissive he is of both superheroics and the virtues that Roxanne believes so heavily in, which is essentially what leads to him becoming a villain in the first place. In other words, Hal was never a great person, not by any means, but he also wasn't an out-and-out sociopath just waiting for his moment to strike. The best way I can figure it, he was just your average creep who would have never done any real good or bad had he lived a normal life. Eventually, Roxanne would have gone with somebody else, Hal would have gotten upset, then moved on to something else after a while. Now, whether you agree with me on that or not is up to you. I'm no professional on this subject, but that's the best way I feel I can sum up Hal's character based off what's shown. Now, of course, there's the issue of why he starts committing such horrible acts once he becomes Titan, and the answer to that question lies in a phrase I've already used in many other Titan videos. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. In other words, you take somebody like Hal, who has loose morals to begin with and feels the world owes him something but it's too lazy to try and get it himself, and give him the powers of a god. It's basically a given that whatever morals he does have will quickly wither away as the temptation to act on his impulses becomes overwhelming. Because when you really think about it, the biggest reason Hal seemed to want to stay out of trouble is because he didn't want to get hurt or arrested. But with his newfound powers, now he could do anything he wanted and not have to suffer any consequences for it. And as I just said, considering he was already weak-minded to begin with, it was inevitable that he would start throwing major temper tantrums when things didn't go his way that would only get worse over time. Though, as I've pointed out many times before, what also didn't help was that Megamind unleashed his latent violent temper, and that was pretty much the point of no return for him. Because when Roxanne rejects him and he sees her going out with somebody else, the worst thing he does is steal a bunch of stuff. Which still isn't good, obviously, but at that point he doesn't seem to want to hurt anybody just yet. But once Megamind reveals everything and awakens his horrible temper, that's when his powers go completely to his head. It's at that point that he realizes he can do anything he wants and nobody can stop him. And as far as he's concerned, it's about time that the entire city pay for holding him back for so long. And it's only once he's been drained of his powers does he come back down from that high. But by that point, it's far too late. Really, perhaps the only redeeming thing about Hal after he becomes Titan is that he simply chooses to kill Roxanne for rejecting him, rather than torturing her or doing anything else to her first. Now, obviously, that isn't saying much by a long shot, but it still has to make one wonder why he didn't take things further, considering how mad he was. It could be he just thought murder was what she deserved, or that his stupidity kept him from coming up with something more elaborate. Or maybe he still subconsciously had boundaries he wouldn't cross, and that's the good Roxanne was seeing in him. Or perhaps it's just because this is a family movie and they didn't even want to hint at anything darker. But whatever the reason is, it's still something that's pretty interesting to note. To put it simply, despite being an open book, there is a lot about Hal that's open to interpretation. But none of this answers the question of whether or not he's supposed to be seen as sympathetic or not. And based off everything I just went over, I'd have to go with not really. Because while the narrative does give him some more humanizing moments, and it's easy to see why some first-time watchers might think he'll actually make for a good hero, when you really look at it, there really isn't much about him to sympathize with. His creep factor and lack of belief in virtues are given a lot of focus, as well as made plain that his obsession with Roxanne is an unhealthy one. So when he ends up becoming a villain, it's less about the tragedy of the hero he might have been, and more about the inevitable outcome coming to fruition. Especially because the movie doesn't hide the fact that if he had just gotten the hint that Roxanne wasn't interested in him, instead of continuing to pursue and feel entitled to her, a lot of the heartache he goes through could have been avoided entirely. So while he didn't seem to be a horrible person before he got his powers, it's pretty safe to say that his fall to villainy really isn't supposed to be seen as a tragic one, or that he's meant to be a character worthy of some sympathy. Alright, that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Hal Stewart is meant to be seen as a sympathetic villain in Megamind? Or do you think he was simply a creep that brought all of his problems on himself? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And let me just once again emphasize that you do not have to agree with anything I said in this video just because you watched it. You are entitled to your own opinion and can feel about how tragic of a character Hal Stewart is supposed to be that you want to, and nobody can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all very much appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.